In a previous video, I showed you how to find the least or lowest common denominator, the LCD, using prime factorization. Now I'm going to show you how to find the LCD using the greatest common factor, also known as the greatest common divisor. So if you don't remember what the greatest common divisor is, please feel free to look at one of my previous videos where I explained that in great detail. So let's say you have two fractions. Let's say you have 7/8 and 7/12. And let's say you wanted to find the least or lowest common denominator for these two fractions. So what is the lowest common denominator for 7/8 and 7/12? Well, you could prime factorize the 8 and the 12 in order to find the lowest common denominator, or alternatively, what you could do is you could just try to find the greatest common factor for 8 and 12. So what is the greatest common factor for 8 and 12? Well, the easiest way to approach this would be to simply list out all the factors for 8 and all the factors for 12, and then find those that are common. So for 8, what are the factors or the divisors of 8? Well, 1 is a divisor of 8. 8 divided by 1 is just 8. 2 is a divisor of 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. 3 is not a divisor of 8. 4 is a divisor of 8. And now we know that because 4 is halfway, it's just essentially half of 8, we will know that 5, 6, 7 are not going to be divisors of 8. So from 5 to 7 inclusive are not going to be divisors of 8. And then we just have 8 being a divisor of 8. 8 divided by 8 is equal to 1. What about 12? Well, for 12, we'll always have 1 a divisor of 12. 2 is a divisor of 12 because 12 is even. 3 is a divisor of 12. 12 divided by 3 is 4. 4 is a divisor of 12 because 12 divided by 4 is 3. 5 is not a divisor of 12. 6 is a divisor of 12. 12 divided by 6 is equal to 2. And then, because 6 is half of 12, we'll know that everything from 7 to 11 inclusive is not a divisor of 12. And then just 12 is a divisor of 12. So which of these factors, these factors of 8 and these factors of 12, or these divisors of 8 and these divisors of 12 are common? 1 is common, 2 is common, 3 is not common because it doesn't divide 8, 4 is common, and 6 is not common, 8 is not common, and 12 is not common. So we only have 1, 2, and 4 being common. So the greatest common factor for 8 and 12 is equal to 4. The greatest common factor for 8 and 12 is equal to 4. Now, how can this help you? How can this help you to find the LCD, or the least or lowest common denominator? Well, the way that you would approach this is you can always find a common denominator for two different numbers by multiplying one denominator by the other denominator in both cases. So if you want to find the common denominator here, you just have to multiply the denominators together, 8 times 12. So a common denominator would be just to multiply these denominators together. So just to find any random common denominator, you just have to take 8 times 12, which is equal to 96. However, this is not your lowest common denominator or your least common denominator. Your least common denominator will be this common denominator divided by your greatest common factor. So your lowest common denominator, your LCD, is going to be equal to 96 divided by your greatest common factor, 4, which is just equal to 24. This is your lowest common denominator. So what is the general procedure? Well, the general procedure is to find the greatest common factor. So when you're faced with two different fractions, you're going to take the denominators from those two fractions, and then you're going to find the greatest common factor or the greatest common denominator for denominator A and B. And then you're going to multiply these denominators. So you're going to multiply A times B and divide it by that greatest common factor. And this is equal to your lowest common denominator or your least common denominator. So let's have another example. Let's have another example of how to find the least common denominator using the greatest common factor. So let's say you have the two fractions 13 over 66 and 19 over 100. And let's say you had to find the lowest common denominator for these two fractions. Well, the first thing you'd have to do is you'd have to find the greatest common factor. Now, in this case, it's not practical to list out all of the factors of 66 and all of the factors of 100 because these lists would be very long. So you would use something like the Euclidean algorithm. And if you don't know what the Euclidean algorithm is, please feel free to see one of my previous videos about what is the Euclidean algorithm. So let's find the greatest common factor for 66 and 100 using the Euclidean algorithm. So once again, take the larger of the two. So the larger of 66 and 100 is 100. And then ask yourself, how many times does 66 fit into 100? Well, 66 is going to fit into 100 only one time. And then 100 minus 66 is only going to give you a remainder of 34. Now, ask yourself, how many times does 34 fit into 66? 34 will fit into 66 only one time, and you're going to have 66 minus 34, 32 left over. Now, ask yourself, how many times does 32 fit into 34? How many times does 32 fit into 34? Well, 32 is only going to fit one time into 34. 34 minus 32 gives you a remainder of 2. And now ask yourself, how many times does 2 fit into 32? So how many times does 2 fit into 32? 2 will fit 16 times into 32, and then you're going to get a remainder of 0. So that means that your greatest common factor is from the line above your second last line, the remainder from your second last line. This is your greatest common factor, also known as your greatest common divisor. So your greatest common factor of 66 and 100 is equal to 2. Now that we've found the greatest common factor, the next step to finding the LCD, the lowest common denominator, so the next step in finding the lowest common denominator is simply to multiply the two denominators. So you're going to multiply 66 by 100, 66 by 100, and you're going to divide it by that greatest common factor. So you're going to divide that by the 2. And this is just going to be equal to 66 times 100 is equal to 6,600. And you're going to divide that by 2, which is equal to 3,300. So 3,300 is the lowest common denominator for 13 over 66 and 19 over 100. So now you know how to find the lowest common denominator using the greatest common factor, also known as the greatest common divisor.